We're going to now hear from Anna Kerr from Australia. She's the country contact for Australia for WDI. She's also Feminist Legal Clinic and a lawyer, and has had a long experience defending women in Australia.
So I've called this talk How to Battle the Patriarchy. Look, I hope that people aren't expecting a talk about the various prominent legal cases that are taking place around the world, or particularly in the United Kingdom. I will just be talking about some of the cases that we've worked on, but only in passing, because it's obviously beyond my capacity to talk about all the different legal actions that can be brought in relation to trans ideology. Every jurisdiction is, of course, different. However, I'm going to give just some brief examples of the range of cases we have worked on that relate to the rights articulated in the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. And I'm just going to give some tips that I have gained from my experiences. So the first tip is to congratulate yourself. A famous quote, which is often misattributed to Gandhi, says, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. So if a trans activist has made a complaint against you, clearly they feel they can't simply ignore or mock you, and they're taking the next step of fighting you. So you're making progress. That's one way to look at it. Look, I won't talk in any detail about this matter, but I think some of you might know of Sal Grover, who is the CEO of Giggle, which is an app, a networking app for women and girls. I'll leave it for Sal Grover at another time to talk about her case. But just to say that males who identify as trans are not only claiming to be women, but they're now claiming to be legally female. And of course, they are able to do that because of legislation that's been passed in some jurisdictions which has allowed them to change their sex on their birth certificates to show that they are female. So we are really battling things because so many of these laws have been passed by stealth already. My second tip is don't surrender without a fight. I think too often women capitulate to the demands of trans activists without even giving any resistance at all, perhaps because they want to be kind, or perhaps because they think resistance is hopeless. Don't underestimate the value of being a thorn in their side. Admittedly, some women have their livelihoods to protect, but even those women in voluntary positions are too often facilitating the work of the trans movement in undermining the rights of women and children in their haste to comply. The case study that I'm highlighting here is the work that we've done supporting breastfeeding counsellors who have continued to use the word mother and breastfeeding despite being bullied and disciplined by the other women in these voluntary organisations. It is very sad to see women working towards their own eradication from not only legislation and policy, but the lexicon generally. And I think the more we can speak to women and get them to understand the importance of putting up some resistance at every step of the way, whenever possible. Third tip, equip yourself. Get some legal advice and some support. Make sure that you're not unwittingly making concessions and compromises which aid the cause of the trans movement. The other side relies on the Tinkerbell effect. If they have enough people who concede that they believe trans women are women, then they're able to make it true using legislation. Don't unwittingly clap for Tinkerbell, no matter how enthusiastic the audience around you might be. Try to resist doing that. The example I've got here is from another area, really. It's relating to the work that Feminist Legal Clinic has done in opposing surrogacy. Catherine Lynch and myself attended a forum. It was hosted by an NGO called the Child Protection, what are they called? Child Protection Identity. Anyhow, they were basically having a forum where they're encouraging discussion about the importance of regulating surrogacy. And I think this is a trap to think that perhaps that's an important thing, that we need to worry about the children who are the victims of surrogacy arrangements and how we can help them maintain their identity. I mean, the trap with this is that you're legitimizing the trade in children by even discussing how it should be regulated. And so it's a bit like discussing how slaves who are being trafficked should have passports, or how body parts being removed for sale should be removed under anaesthetic, or maybe talking about how murderers have to comply with health regulations. It's a bit difficult to argue with any of these things, but I think it's a clever strategy of leading people to accept the unacceptable by debating that. The next tip is sort of to recognise that we are outflanked, not to get disheartened and to give up, but to recognise, that sometimes you have to preserve your energy, because realistically, the medical and legal professions have been captured to some extent, and we're fighting a very difficult battle. The master's tools might never destroy the master's house, but we should be able to slow the construction of a second story while we figure out another way. And the case study here, I'm referring to the case of Beth Rep, who had a claim made against her for transgender vilification by Bridget Clinch, who's in the photograph above. And this went on for 4 years. There were various proceedings, and we were successful in winding back the worst aspects of the original decision, but nevertheless, it was still a very unsatisfactory outcome. And Beth was ordered to pay a certain amount in compensation to Bridget Clinch. And ideally, it would have been great to have continued on and appealed it further. But after 4 years, and with no guarantee of success at the next level, which would have been the Supreme Court of the ACT, understandably, Beth had had enough. I think the thing is, I don't think it's wasted effort to fight these things. The more of us put up a fight, the more difficult it will be for them to progress things. But it's not a matter of fighting endlessly. I think people do have to consider their energy and preserve it to some extent. And some battles maybe aren't worth having. Tip 5, advocate for the rights of all women. I think I just put this at, I think it's important for us to highlight the diversity of women who are opposed to trans ideology, because there is a tendency by the trans movement to depict this as a battle between conservatives and progressives. And they, of course, align themselves with progressive side of politics. Of course, we know that that's very untrue and misleading, but I think it's important at every opportunity to highlight that women of all political persuasions and sexual orientations are negatively impacted by the loss of women's sex-based rights. And this is a photo of Jessica Hoyle, who has an ongoing case in Tasmania because she requested permission to hold a lesbian drag king event in Launceston, and she wanted to exclude males, and the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner said no. And as a result, we are now appealing that decision in the tribunal. And Jessica is joined by LGB Alliance Australia in bringing that case. The next tip is the importance of using the court of public opinion. But of course, in order to do that, the public has to know what's happening. And we have a problem at the moment with media censorship. It's really very difficult to get the mainstream media to cover these stories. So I think it's very important that we don't let them advance by stealth, and that we expose what's happening. And the case study I have here is in relation to the founder and lead candidate for the Women's Party at the last federal election. This person was a male who had 3 wives and 3 children before having had gender reassignment surgery. And the mainstream media was very reluctant to make this fact public, but we eventually did manage to get some coverage in the right-wing media. And I'm happy to say they weren't successful in the election, and they have now been deregistered. I think we can all see the importance of this tip. It's not always about winning, and I think we all know that the recent coverage in relation to Leah Thomas and the photos of him alongside his competitors, and of Laurel Hubbard, for instance, in the lead up to the Olympics, were extremely helpful in raising public awareness of the entire issue. Those other individuals there photographed are trans activists who make their presence felt not only on the sporting field, but through our legal system in Australia. Tip 8 is about emphasising the non-violent nature of feminist resistance. The trans movement are only too keen to depict us as violent or aggressive or intimidating. It's very important that we don't give them any grounds for that. In one of our cases, one of our supporters turned up at the tribunal with a carton of eggs. It was very unwise. This was then cited as evidence against my client throughout the rest of the proceedings as an indication that she had incited hatred and violence, although she'd had nothing to do with it at all. It's tremendously unhelpful to provide them with a basis for claiming that we're the aggressors and they are the victims. I've attended a protest as well, a counter protest at McIver's ladies' pools, and again we had the problem that the media took a photo of one of us looking as if she was being restrained by the police, and it was terribly unfair. And in fact, we'd been abused for a prolonged period by a trans activist, really using very florid language, and neither the police nor the media had responded to that at all, but instead had put this photo of one of our protesters in the paper. So please don't give them ammunition in this regard. And I just remember why we are doing this. Remember why we are fighting this battle. Don't lose sight of the fact that what we're doing is trying to protect women, children, other vulnerable people from harm. We may be told that we're not being kind, but there's nothing kind about keeping quiet about the abuses of human rights that are taking place under the guise of the trans movement. Thank you very much. And that's my talk for today.